May 1st, 1960. Morning. 21 kilometers above the Ural Mountains, an aircraft is flying where no aircraft should be. He has been airborne for hours, with half a country still ahead. Flights like this ran up to 9 hours, food coming through a tube in the helmet. In his pocket sat the items that explain this job better than any briefing. Foreign currency, a note asking for help in a dozen languages, and a poisoned needle hidden inside a coin. On paper, he was a civilian pilot with no rank and no insignia. If anything went wrong, officially, he did not exist. He is flying so high that the sky beyond the canopy has turned almost black, and the ground looks less like ground than like a map. He breathes pure oxygen inside a heavy pressure suit and does what he has done many times. Switch on the cameras, mark the airfields. Hold the aircraft level, calm, almost bored. He is not hiding and not maneuvering. He does not need to. For 4 years, aircraft like this had crossed a foreign country as if it had no roof, tracked the whole way. Not once had anyone reached them. The aircraft was a flying camera, born out of ordinary fear. There were no spy satellites yet, and the two most powerful nations on Earth watched each other almost blind. Not knowing was more dangerous than any weapon, because the mind fills an empty space with the worst possible answer. So they built a machine around a lens, armor, guns, structural strength, even a proper landing gear, all stripped away. What remained was enormous wings, one engine, and a roll of film. Its whole defense was a number on the altimeter. Altitude was not a tactic. Altitude was armor. 21 kilometers meant something very simple. They can see you, they can hate you, and they can do nothing about it. That morning, the pilot believes it too. He does not know that below him, among muddy fields and small villages, something has been set up that he has never met on any flight. In a few minutes, his aircraft will lose its tail. For Moscow, those 4 years had been a quiet humiliation. Operators tracked the blip across half the country and scrambled fighters that came back with nothing. Complaining in public was impossible because admitting a foreign aircraft over your territory meant admitting you could not shoot it down. So the protests went by whisper, while inside the country the question was asked far more harshly. The weapon that fired on May 1st was not born out of inspiration. It was born out of anger. To understand why that morning mattered so much, you first have to understand why altitude protected anyone at all. High up, the air runs out. Not suddenly, but by 20 kilometers, so little is left that almost nothing works. An engine has nothing to breathe. It swallows emptiness and loses thrust. A wing has nothing to hold on to. To avoid falling, you must fly very fast, and the same thin air is what stops you. Up there, an aircraft hangs on a thread. One sharp movement and the thread snaps, which is why a fighter cannot get there. It can jump above its own ceiling for a few seconds, but up there, it is no longer in charge. It cannot turn, cannot aim, cannot chase. Guns were even more useless. A shell climbs while losing speed every second and arrives tired and random. In the last big war, gun crews fired thousands of shells for one aircraft. Down low, quantity worked. At 20 kilometers, quantity meant nothing. So the problem looked like this. You need something that does not fly like an aircraft and does not fall like a shell. Something that climbs on its own and can still change its mind in flight because the target moves while it climbs. And here is the real engineering problem, the one that gets skipped. Building a rocket that reaches 20 kilometers was not hard. The Germans tried it at the end of the war, and their rockets did climb. The problem was that the rocket had no head. It flew where it had been pushed, not where the enemy was. The question was, who would think for it during the 30 seconds when everything is decided? By the early 50s, this had stopped being theory. Bombers had appeared that could deliver more destruction in one aircraft than an entire air fleet of the previous war. The answer came from the top, and its scale was monstrous, a ring around the capital. Dozens of positions, concrete, roads, thousands of people. It worked. It cost as much as a small war, and it could not move a single meter. One dot on the map was covered perfectly. Everything else stayed wide open. So the designers were handed a different task, and that is where the legend actually starts. Not perfect, not forever, cheap and able to be driven away. Behind the new system stood two men and two very different schools. One built the eyes and the brain, the part that looks and calculates. The other built the rocket. Nobody asked them for a miracle. They were asked for fast and for many. And here is the part that gets left out. They deliberately refused every clever thing they knew how to build. No seeker of its own, no searching in flight. Only what a factory could turn out in series, and what a 20-year-old could operate after 6 months. That was almost a philosophical decision. What came out of it was not beautiful, not a trace of elegance. Trucks, trailers, cables across a field, a van with a radar in the middle and 6 launchers around it like petals. From the air, it looked like a star scratched into the ground. Not a weapon of the future, more like a construction site that had learned how to kill. Inside, the logic was almost naive. The missile was not smart. The missile was obedient. It had no idea where it was going. The van on the ground did the thinking. It found the aircraft, held it, calculated the meeting point, and told the missile where to turn, the whole way, as if walking it on a radio leash. That trick is what made the system possible. Everything expensive stayed on the ground, where it could be reused. What flew upward was a cheap tube with fins. Seen from outside, the launch looked unreal. The missile climbs heavily at first, shoved by a booster, then throws it away like unwanted weight. Then it builds speed, 3 times faster than sound, into air that has almost stopped existing. And at the end, it does not hit the aircraft, which is nearly impossible. It understands that the target is close and detonates, throwing thousands of pieces of metal around itself. Up there, one hole in the right place is all an aircraft needs. The price of that simplicity was paid by people. The missile was fueled with liquids that ate through metal, cloth, and skin. Crews worked in rubber suits and masks, half blind in the heat, knowing a leaking missile was more dangerous than any enemy. And these were very ordinary young men, living beside the position for months without a fight. Their real enemy was boredom, because the job came down to being ready for 2 minutes that might never happen. Years later, in the jungle, that drilling decided who went home. But the real compromise was not in the fuel, it was in the radar. To see a target, a radar has to shout. It throws a signal into the sky and listens for the echo. So the second it begins to see, it can be heard 100 kilometers away. A system built to defend could only work by giving itself away. There was no way around it then. And that one forced concession defined the next 60 years of war in the air. There were other concessions, smaller but painful. The van handled 1 target at a time. Packing up took half a day. The position could not be hidden. Too much steel, too many wheel tracks. It was designed as a shield, standing in one place. It became an ambush instead. And that was discovered not in offices, but in someone else's sky. The first shot was a quiet one. In '59, a reconnaissance aircraft disappeared over China at a height that was supposed to be untouchable. In the West, nobody understood. No fighter scene, no explosion. The aircraft simply stopped existing. And then came May 1st, 1960. Near Sverdlovsk, a salvo was fired at one lone aircraft. The first missile did not score a direct hit. It exploded nearby, and that was enough. A machine built for thin air and perfectly smooth flight lost its tail and came down from 21 kilometers, breaking apart on the way. The pilot survived. He was not supposed to, and that turned a military incident into a political catastrophe. Washington announced a weather aircraft had strayed over Turkey. Moscow said nothing for days, then displayed the wreckage and the pilot, alive, talking, with his maps. The summit in Paris collapsed within 2 weeks. But what really died that day was not an agreement. What died was the idea that altitude protects anybody. 2 years later, a second aircraft of the same type was shot down over Cuba, and for a few hours, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before, because of one pilot in one cockpit. And then came Vietnam, where everything that had been an argument between superpowers turned into daily arithmetic. America arrived in that sky with the best air force in the world and total confidence that the sky belonged to it. The first sign of trouble was a photograph. Near Hanoi, that same star scratched into the ground, 6 petals around a center. They recognized it instantly, and they were forbidden to bomb it because it had not fired yet, and hitting it might turn a local war into a large one. On the 24th of July, 1965, it fired first. A fighter fell out of the sky, and an era of confidence ended with it. Then the system was reinvented by people who had never designed it. The Vietnamese understood quickly that standing still meant dying. Positions moved at night, by hand, through mud, sometimes dragged on ropes across rice fields. On abandoned sites, they left decoys of bamboo and rags, and American aircraft dutifully spent bombs on them. A fence built around a capital had become a nomadic hunter that shoots and vanishes. From there, asymmetry took over, and it was more frightening than any missile. A missile cost about as much as a good car. An aircraft cost as much as a small factory, and a trained pilot has no price you can put in a budget. But the worst part was this: the missile won even when it missed. A miss pushed aircraft down low, where ordinary guns waited. A miss forced crews to drop bombs early. A miss took up space under the wing, where a bomb could have been. One van changed hundreds of missions without shooting anyone down. The American pilots had their own problem, and it sat in offices rather than in the jungle. Target lists were approved across an ocean. Some sites were off limits, and routes repeated for weeks. The same bridges, the same valleys, the same time of approach. On the ground, all of it was memorized. Pilots flew knowing they were expected exactly there, and that changing the route was not theirs to decide. The cheapest missile in the world was being fought by the most expensive air force in the world, hands tied by its own caution. The answer had to be invented on the move, and at first it was human, not technical. Pilots were taught to hear radar. A receiver in the cockpit turned an invisible signal into sound in the headphones. A steady hum meant you were being felt out. A rising tone meant you were being held, and if the sound turned rapid and insistent, a missile was already on its way, and 5 seconds were left to throw the aircraft sideways and make it miss. Then came the men who went further. Their job sounded like mockery. Fly in first, put yourself into someone else's gun sight, and work as live bait until the position reveals itself. When it was explained to them, one pilot replied with a phrase that became their motto: "You have got to be kidding me." Nobody was kidding. The odds of finishing a full tour were close to a coin toss, and they went in first anyway, so everyone else could cross clean sky. And then came the weapon that flipped the duel for good. A missile that flew not at the aircraft but at the signal, riding an enemy beam back down to its source. It was crude, with an obvious flaw. If the radar switched off, it went blind. Yet that flaw made it a different kind of weapon. You did not have to use it. It was enough to show that you could. The crew below saw the threat and switched the radar off to survive. And a radar that is switched off kills nobody. Everything after that was a war of tricks. Clouds of metal foil, radars flicked on for 2 seconds, more jamming boxes under American wings. That is what the war in the air had become. Not maneuvers, not speed, not who had the better wing. A few seconds of silence and nerve. Who switches on first? Who blinks first? Over the years in Vietnam, thousands of missiles brought down roughly 200 aircraft, and by the end, a single kill cost dozens of launches. By that arithmetic, the Americans won the argument. In reality, they lost it, because something had been taken that cannot be given back. A calm sky. After Vietnam, nobody ever flew the old way again. In '73, in the Middle East, the very same vans knocked down dozens of aircraft in days and forced an entire army to rewrite its war plan. 9 years later, in the same valley, They were answered in the only way that works. First, the eyes were blinded, and only then did anyone shoot at the rest. In '99, over the Balkans, a related system 30 years out of date pulled an aircraft considered invisible out of the sky. Every modern fighter, every drone, every first strike doctrine carries the memory of that van with a radar. The most expensive legacy of this missile does not look like a missile. If you cannot outrun a radar and cannot climb above it, only one option is left. Make sure the echo never comes back. That single thought produced strange, angular aircraft without one rounded line, coatings that swallow signals, and an industry worth tens of billions. All of it answers a question, first asked by a van in a muddy field. The missile never won a single war. What it did was change the question. Before, the sky asked who flies higher and faster. From that day on, it asks who saw first and who managed to stay quiet longer. The pilot at 21 kilometers was certain that altitude protected him. After him, nobody believed that again.